Hello everyone, welcome everyone to the channel's Strange Night Podcast. Story 1. The Watts Family Murders. Hello and welcome. I am your resident horror storytelling expert. Tonight we begin our journey into the darkest corners of the American family. This first story is haunting due to the chilling contrast between a happy photograph and a cold-blooded truth. The case of Chris Watts. Chris and Shanann Watts lived in Frederick, Colorado with their two beautiful young daughters, Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, and an unborn son. Looking at Shanann's Facebook page, you would see a model family. The pictures were full of smiles, posts praising Chris as the best husband and father in the world, and videos of their seemingly affluent life. It was the image of a perfect American dream. But within the four walls of that house, the thing called love had rotted away. On August 13th, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip at 1:48 a.m. She was dropped off by a colleague. This was the last time anyone saw Shanann and her children alive. A few hours later, a close friend of Shanann's, after being unable to contact her, came to the Watts home. The friend called the police. When they arrived, Shanann was gone. Her car was still in the garage, her wallet and phone were in the house, and she had logged off social media, something completely out of character for her. Everything grew ominous when Chris Watts, the husband, showed up. In the days that followed, Chris Watts became the focus of every news report. He stood before the cameras, his eyes vacant and his words disjointed, pleading for his wife and daughters to return. He claimed Shanann had told him she was going to visit friends. "If you are out there," he struggled to say, "please come back. I miss my girls so much. I miss my wife so much." The police and seasoned criminal investigators immediately noticed the unnaturalness in Chris's demeanor. He wasn't panicked. His worries seemed like a rehearsed performance. His statements were constantly changing and full of contradictions. He mentioned that he and Shanann had an emotional conversation that night. When the police asked Chris to take a polygraph test, the result was a complete failure. The reactions indicated that he was lying when he denied knowing his wife and children's whereabouts. Faced with the evidence, especially the neighbor's security camera footage showing Chris driving his work truck out of the house in the morning Shanann disappeared, and other footage capturing him loading something onto the vehicle, Chris's resistance collapsed. The confrontation in the interrogation room was a moment of sheer horror. Initially, Chris only admitted that he and Shanann had argued. He claimed that Shanann had strangled the two daughters after he told her he wanted a divorce, and in a fit of rage, he murdered her in revenge. But that story couldn't hold up. The subsequent autopsy results, along with deeper investigations, revealed the gruesome truth. Chris Watts had planned it. He was having an affair and wanted to escape the burden of his family, including his unborn child. On that fateful morning, after Shanann returned home, Chris strangled her to death. He then loaded his wife's body onto the floor of his truck and put his two daughters, Bella and Celeste, still alive, onto the vehicle. He drove over 60 miles to an oil field property where he worked. There, he committed the most heinous act, murdering his two young daughters. Bella and Celeste were killed before their bodies were dumped into two separate oil tanks. Shanann's body was hastily buried nearby. The most heartbreaking detail of the case came from Chris's own account of the children's final moments. Bella, the older daughter, was the last one alive. In her panic, Bella woke up and asked, "Daddy, what's happening?" Witnessing the death of her mother and sister, Bella pleaded with her father, "Daddy, please don't do this to me." That plea did not move the father's heart. When the police found the bodies, the truth of Chris Watts's deceit was fully exposed. A family had been wiped out simply because a man wanted a fresh start. Chris Watts was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, he is held in a maximum security prison. The story of Chris Watts is a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators live right inside our homes, masquerading as the perfect husband and father in the photograph. Story 2. The Shadow in the Parlor. Welcome back to the True Crime Horror Series. If Episode 1 told a story of modern crime exposed by technology, Episode 2 takes us back to an era where secrets could be buried forever behind the doors of a wealthy conservative family. Fall River, Massachusetts, August 4th, 1892. It was a hot, stifling summer morning. The Borden family home on 2nd Street was a symbol of wealth and strictness. Andrew Borden, a rich but frugal banker and real estate businessman, lived there with his second wife, Abby Borden, and his 2 unmarried daughters from his previous marriage, Emma and Lizzie. Despite its perfect exterior, the Borden house was filled with tension and resentment. Lizzie, the 32-year-old younger daughter, particularly despised her stepmother, Abby. She believed Abby only wanted her father's fortune. At around 10:30 a.m., the family maid, Bridget Sullivan, was resting in her room when she heard Lizzie's piercing screams from downstairs.
"Father's dead. Someone has killed Father."
Bridget rushed down and found Andrew Borden lying face down on the parlor sofa. His head had been brutally hacked by multiple blows from an axe. Blood splattered everywhere. It was a horrific scene, a savage massacre in broad daylight. As the police arrived at the scene, Lizzie was strangely calm. She recounted that she had just returned from a trip to the barn. She claimed she heard groans as she entered the house. When police began searching the home, they discovered another terrifying truth. In an upstairs bedroom, Abby Borden was found dead. She had been assaulted even more savagely than her husband. She had been struck about 18 times with an axe on her head and neck, and she likely died around 9 a.m., over an hour before Andrew was murdered. This meant the killer had remained in the house during that time, waiting for the next victim. Immediately, all suspicion fell upon Lizzie. Who could kill 2 people in the same house without making any noise other than a family member? Lizzie Borden became the center of the investigation. Her statements constantly changed, further fueling the detectives' suspicions. She claimed she was in the hot, stuffy barn for a long period that summer morning, but couldn't clearly explain what she was doing. The physical evidence against Lizzie was weak, but the behavioral evidence was strong. A few days before the murders, Lizzie had attempted to purchase cyanide poison. This, coupled with her strange behavior, including burning a stained old dress in the kitchen stove a few days after the crime, reinforced the accusations. Lizzie claimed the dress was stained with paint, but police believed it was blood. The case shook America. No one could believe that a woman from the upper class could commit such a barbaric act with an axe. The trial of Lizzie Borden was a massive media event. Prosecutors painted a picture of a woman obsessed with her father's frugality and hatred for her stepmother, which finally exploded into a violent rage. However, the jury, entirely composed of men, could not reconcile the image of a genteel woman committing murder with an axe. There were no witnesses, no direct evidence, and the prosecutor failed to prove a clear motive for the brutality. After just over an hour of deliberation, the jury declared Lizzie Borden not guilty. Lizzie was freed, but her reputation was permanently destroyed.
She and her sister Emma left the old house. Lizzie lived the rest of her life as a social outcast in Fall River, always watched by the suspicious eyes of the public. Although acquitted, the case was never solved. The question of who killed Andrew and Abby Borden has become an enduring American horror legend.
And perhaps some family secrets will remain buried forever, leaving only the chilling rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Story 3. Blood Promise. Welcome back to episode 3. If the previous 2 stories explored the breakdown of ordinary and aristocratic families, today we step into the collapse of a powerful dynasty in the low country of South Carolina. This is the story of Alec Murdaugh and a family destroyed by deceit and violence. For generations, the name Murdaugh was synonymous with law and power across 5 coastal counties of South Carolina. Alec Murdaugh, a prominent lawyer, was the rightful heir to this empire. He lived a life of luxury with his wife, Maggie, and 2 sons, Buster and Paul, at their expansive, secluded hunting estate known as Moselle. However, before that fateful night, the Murdaugh empire had begun to crack. On the night of Sunday, June 7, 2021, around 10 p.m., Alec called the police. His voice trembling, he claimed he had just discovered his wife and youngest son, Paul, had been murdered near the kennels at Moselle. Police quickly arrived and found a horrific scene. Both Maggie and Paul were shot multiple times with 2 different types of weapons, indicating a brutal and cold-blooded double murder. Paul was killed with a shotgun and Maggie with an assault rifle. Initially, Alec Murdaugh appeared as a grieving husband and father, a victim of an attack with an unknown motive. However, authorities quickly realized this was no ordinary robbery homicide. Paul Murdaugh was already a controversial figure. He was facing criminal charges related to a fatal 2019 boat accident where a young woman was killed. That case had already plunged the Murdaugh family into serious legal trouble. The focus began to shift from external enemies to the family itself. Alec became the prime suspect as investigators delved into his personal life. They uncovered a massive web of financial deception. Alex had been embezzling millions of dollars from his law firm and from vulnerable clients to feed a drug addiction and an uncontrollable, lavish lifestyle. At the time Maggie and Paul were murdered, Alex's financial troubles were about to be exposed. The turning point in the case was the video from Paul's phone. In his initial testimony, Alex Murdaugh vehemently claimed he had been napping, then visited his ailing mother, and was not present at the kennels with Maggie and Paul at the time they were murdered. However, a video Paul recorded just before his death, recovered from the victim's phone, changed everything. This video contained Alex Murdaugh's voice, clearly standing with Maggie and Paul at the dog kennels, just minutes before they were killed. Alex's lie was exposed. It was then the police believed they understood the motive. Alex killed his wife and son to create a family tragedy, to divert attention from his impending financial crimes, hoping to gain sympathy and stop the investigations into his money. 6 months after the tragedy, Alex Murdaugh was arrested and charged with the murders of Maggie and Paul. His trial was a national event, exposing all the family's worst secrets. During the trial, Alex tried to maintain his lie, but he was indirectly contradicted by his surviving son, Buster, and most critically, by the audio evidence from Paul's phone. This story is more than just a murder. It is a chilling reminder that power and wealth cannot conceal the darkest of crimes. Alec Murdaugh betrayed the promise of a father and a husband. turning love into blood and greed. Ultimately, Alec Murdaugh was convicted on 2 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, closing the door on the downfall of a centuries-old dynasty destroyed by its own secrets. Story 4: The Demon from Seattle. Welcome back to Episode 4. Tonight we step away from domestic crimes to confront a true serial predator, one who terrorized Washington state for decades. In the early 1980s, a dark shadow began to fall over the Seattle and Puget Sound area, Washington. The bodies of young women started appearing along the banks of the Green River, then spread to distant forests, landfills, and parks. The killer's victims were primarily young women, many of whom were sex workers or runaways. These victims were often marginalized by society, making the killer's crimes harder to detect and investigate. Police quickly realized they were dealing with a serial killer. They dubbed him the Green River Killer. Fear gripped the region. Throughout that decade, dozens of young women went missing. Their families waited in agony while detectives and task forces worked tirelessly. But the killer always evaded capture. What makes this case so chilling is that Gary Ridgway lived an utterly normal life. He worked as a truck painter at Kenworth Truck Company for 32 years. He married and divorced several times, living a quiet suburban life. He even attended church. No one suspected that this ordinary, seemingly mild-mannered man was the monster the entire region was hunting. All the while, Ridgway was secretly luring, driving, and murdering his victims, often right inside his work truck. He admitted to returning to the Green River area to move and conceal the victims' bodies, an act of cold-hearted inhumanity. Despite having multiple suspects and being interviewed numerous times, Ridgway was always released. He was questioned several times due to his association with some victims and because he frequented the areas where sex workers operated, yet he always managed to convince the police of his innocence. The Green River Killer case remained cold until the early 2000s. Forensic science finally caught up with Ridgway's secrets. With the advent of advanced DNA analysis technology, investigators decided to re-examine the semen and bodily fluid samples collected from some of the victims back in the 1980s. In 2001, these DNA samples matched Gary Ridgway. This breakthrough ended the 2-decade-long hunt. Gary Ridgway was arrested. During interrogation, Ridgway finally confessed to his crimes. His utter lack of emotion while detailing how he murdered and disposed of the bodies astonished even the most seasoned detectives. To avoid the death penalty, as Washington state still had capital punishment at the time, Ridgway agreed to a plea deal with prosecutors. He would help locate any missing bodies and confess to every crime he had committed. This deal brought closure to dozens of grieving families. Ridgway confessed to murdering 49 women. However, investigators believe the true number may exceed 71 victims. Gary Ridgway was a predator who perfectly concealed his brutal nature behind the facade of an ordinary working man. He proved that evil doesn't necessarily dwell in the shadows. Sometimes, it is the person we pass on the street every day, the silent truck painter, the quiet neighbor. He was sentenced to consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a punishment that, even today, many believe is insufficient for the terror and brutality he inflicted. Story 5: The Fateful Pact. Welcome back to Episode 5. Tonight, we turn back the clock to Chicago in the 1920s, the dazzling and defiant jazz age. This story is not about desperation or domestic violence, but about 2 young, wealthy geniuses who attempted to rise above the law and morality with a deadly social experiment. Nathan Leopold, 19 years old, and Richard Loeb, 18 years old, were two exceptionally gifted students. Leopold was a talented ornithologist who spoke 5 languages. Loeb was one of the youngest graduates of the University of Michigan in history. Both came from wealthy and high-status Jewish families in Chicago society. They were more than just friends. Their relationship was built on a perverse pact: intellectual complicity. Loeb was obsessed with the idea of becoming a master criminal. Leopold was obsessed with Loeb. Together, they developed a nihilistic theory that individuals of superior intelligence, like themselves, had the right to transcend conventional moral rules, even murder, because they belonged to the class of supermen, Übermensch, as described by the philosopher Nietzsche. They believed they could commit the perfect crime, a murder that would leave no trace, an intellectual challenge to the justice system. After months of meticulous planning, on May 21, 1924, they decided to act. Their victim was 14-year-old Bobby Franks, a wealthy neighbor and Loeb's second cousin. Franks was not targeted out of hatred, but merely out of convenience and randomness. Loeb and Leopold lured Franks into their rented car. While driving, Loeb struck the boy on the head with a chisel. They stuffed Frank's body into a drainage culvert in a marshy area south of Chicago. They then executed the second step of their plan, sending an anonymous ransom note to Frank's father, Jacob Franks, demanding $10,000. Their motive was not the money, but to create a false narrative to cover up their crime. While Loeb and Leopold thought they were enacting a perfect criminal drama, one small mistake ruined their entire plan. As police and the Franks family were arranging the ransom exchange, Bobby Frank's body was discovered by a laborer. Near the body, police found a critical piece of evidence, a unique pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses. The glasses had a special and rare hinge, allowing police to trace the number of people who used them in the area. Investigators quickly tracked down the owner. It was Nathan Leopold. When interrogated, Leopold and Loeb were exposed. Initially, they tried to stick to their story, claiming their car had been stolen by strangers who committed the crime. But detectives, exploiting the inconsistencies in their testimonies, eventually led Loeb to confess. Loeb blamed Leopold, and Leopold subsequently confessed everything. The case shocked the entire nation, not only because of its brutality, but because of its arrogant motive. Two intelligent young men from prominent families murdered an innocent boy merely for a challenge. Since both had confessed, the trial focused on whether they would receive the death penalty. Their families hired the famous defense attorney Clarence Darrow, who delivered one of the most famous anti-death penalty speeches in history. Darrow argued that the two boys were victims of faulty upbringing, and their inhumanity was evidence of mental illness rather than a capital offense. The case concluded with sentences of life imprisonment plus 99 years for both, sparing them the death penalty. The crime of Leopold and Loeb is a chilling tale about the danger of intelligence unchecked by humanity. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are not the frenzied ones, but the cold-hearted ones who deem themselves superhuman. Story 6. The Deadly Kiss. Welcome back to episode 6. Tonight's story is a classic example of love turning into obsessive hatred. This is the tragedy of Betty Broderick, who transformed from a model society housewife in San Diego to a killer in a protracted journey of revenge. Betty and Dan Broderick had a seemingly perfect marriage. Betty worked tirelessly to support Dan through medical and Harvard Law School. After years of struggle, Dan became a famous medical malpractice lawyer in San Diego, and Betty was the mother of 4 children living in a lavish mansion. But as Dan Broderick reached the peak of his career, their marriage began to fracture. Around 1983, when Dan was 38, Betty began to suspect him of having an affair with his beautiful young legal assistant, Linda Kolkina. Dan vehemently denied it, but the truth was soon revealed. In 1985, Dan left Betty, initiating one of the longest and most bitter divorces in San Diego history, dubbed America's Divorce. In the ensuing years, Betty's life descended into chaos. She felt betrayed not only by her husband, but also by the legal system that Dan was a part of. Dan, using his legal skills, gained control over all finances, assets, and custody of the children. Betty believed she was being gaslighted and pushed to the brink of insanity. Betty's anger erupted into an uncontrollable rage. She constantly harassed Dan and Linda, leaving threatening messages on their answering machine and driving her car into Dan's front door. She felt that she had dedicated her entire life to Dan's success, only to be discarded for a younger woman. Dan married Linda Kolkina in April 1989. This was the moment Betty's rage reached its climax. In the early morning hours of Sunday, November 5, 1989, Betty Broderick carried out her final act of revenge. She took a revolver and drove to Dan and Linda's home. Betty used her daughter's key to unlock the door and walked into the bedroom where the couple was sleeping. In that terrifying moment, Betty fired 5 shots. The first bullet struck Linda in the head, killing her instantly. The subsequent shots hit Dan in the chest and torso. Dan collapsed after trying to reach the phone. After committing the crime, Betty ripped the phone out of the wall and dropped her daughters off at a friend's house. She then turned herself in to the police. Betty Broderick's testimony in court captured public attention. She claimed she committed the murder accidentally. She had only intended to commit suicide in Dan's bedroom, but was startled by Linda and fired wildly. However, the jury heard recordings of Betty's prior threats and accounts of her suppressed anger. In both trials, the first resulted in a hung jury. Betty maintained that she was a victim of Dan, who had committed the perfect crime by manipulating her to the point of madness. Finally, in 1991, Betty Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. The Betty Broderick case is a horror story not just about violence, but about how betrayal, the breakdown of marriage, and the legal system can push an ordinary woman from a conventional life to the brink of murder. Story 7. The Phantom on the Avenue. Welcome back to episode 7. Tonight we delve into one of the biggest and most terrifying unsolved mysteries in American criminal history, the Zodiac Killer case. This is a story about a fear that could not be named, spreading across the San Francisco Bay Area, and a killer who was never caught. In the winter of 1968, in Vallejo, California, the terror began. On the night of December 20th, David Faraday, age 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, age 16, were shot and killed in their car on a desolate road. This was Zodiac's first confirmed attack. 6 months later, on July 4th, 1969, a similar attack occurred in a public parking lot. Darlene Farron was shot dead, and her boyfriend, Mike Mageau, was severely injured. Following this second crime, a man called the police, claiming responsibility for both attacks, providing a detailed description of the weapon. The fear began. However, what made this killer famous and notorious was his challenging conduct. In August 1969, 3 major newspapers in the San Francisco Bay Area received nearly identical letters. In the letters, the killer claimed responsibility for the crimes and threatened to kill more people if the letters were not published. Each letter was accompanied by a segment of a complex cipher known as the Z408. The killer demanded that the newspapers print this cipher, claiming it contained his identity. He called himself Zodiac. The first cipher was solved by a school teacher and his wife. The message did not reveal an identity, but made a chilling statement. "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl." Zodiac did not stop there. He continued to terrorize the area. In September 1969, Zodiac attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard with a knife at Lake Berryessa. Hartnell survived, but Shepard died from her wounds. Chillingly, Zodiac left a handwritten message on the victim's car door, a cross circle, his symbol, along with the dates and times of the murders. The last confirmed murder occurred in October 1969, when taxi driver Paul Stein was shot and killed in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. A blood-stained piece of fabric from Stein's shirt was later included in Zodiac's next letter. For years, Zodiac continued to send letters and ciphers to the media and the police. He boasted about the police's inability to catch him, taunting them with arrogant language. This anonymity turned Zodiac into a phantom. Police had hundreds of suspects, but never enough evidence to indict anyone. Although experts managed to crack some of his other ciphers, like the Z340, they still did not reveal the killer's identity. The Zodiac killer case became a national obsession, representing the collective fear of a ruthless murderer who seemed capable of acting at will and vanishing into thin air. To this day, the Zodiac killer remains an unsolved mystery. His true identity is still buried within the unbroken ciphers and yellowed letters. The terror he inflicted was not just in the number of victims, but in the fact that he won. He played his mind game, and he escaped punishment. Story 8. The Guilty Daughter. Welcome back to Episode 8. Tonight's story is one of the most heartbreaking cases in American criminal history because it touches upon the most sacred bond, motherhood. This is the story of Diane Downs, who did the unimaginable to gain the personal freedom she craved. On the night of May 19, 1983, Diane Downs, 27, pulled her red Nissan to a screeching halt in front of a hospital in Springfield, Oregon. She was screaming in panic, begging for help. She claimed her car had just been attacked by a strange man on a remote country road. The scene inside the car was horrific. Diane was shot in the arm, but her 3 children were far more seriously wounded. Christy, 8, Cheryl, 7, and Danny, 3, were in the car, all shot at close range. Cheryl was killed instantly. Christy and Danny were critically injured. Diane recounted a tearful story. A strange man attempted to carjack her. When she resisted, he shot her and the children. Police quickly investigated Diane's story. However, detectives and even medical staff noticed the unnaturalness in Diane's demeanor. Despite her injury and her 3 children struggling for life, Diane appeared overly calm. She spent more time worrying about her car and spoke to detectives about the attack details with a chilling detachment, showing almost no emotion for a mother who had just endured such a tragedy. The evidence at the scene also contradicted her testimony. The road was not a deserted country road as Diane described. It was near homes, and there were no signs that a carjacking had occurred. More importantly, there were no fingerprints from any strange man in or on the car.
During her treatment, the daughter, Christy, who suffered a stroke from her injury, had to relearn how to speak. It was Christy's testimony that tore through Diane's web of lies. Christy told detectives that it was her mother, Diane Downs, who shot them.
She remembered her mother pulling out the gun, shooting Cheryl, then turning the gun on her and Danny, and finally shooting herself in the arm. What was Diane's motive? Investigators looked into Diane's relationship with her lover, a man in Arizona. This man had made it clear he did not want children in his life. Diane attempted to orchestrate a life without her children to keep her boyfriend. To Diane, her 3 children, the children she had birthed and raised, were merely obstacles on her path to personal happiness. Diane Downs' trial shocked the nation. She appeared charismatic, yet was underlined by cold indifference. Confronted with the testimony of Christy, who had to use dolls to reenact her mother's crime due to her grief and fear, Diane maintained her innocence. However, the jury was convinced. Christy's testimony, the inconsistencies in Diane's account, and the heartless motive led to a guilty verdict. Deese Downs was convicted of murder, attempted murder, and assault. She was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 50 years. Diane Downs' crime is a horrific reminder that not all predators lurk in the dark. Sometimes, the most terrifying betrayer is the one we trust the most, a mother who was willing to sacrifice her own flesh and blood for personal selfishness. Story 9. The Milwaukee Cannibal. Welcome back to episode 9. Tonight we will delve into the abyss of human depravity and madness. This story is about Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee serial killer, who became a symbol of the most heinous crimes and a stark failure of the system. For years, Jeffrey Dahmer lived quietly in apartment 213 in a seemingly ordinary residential complex in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Neighbors frequently complained about the terrible stench emanating from his apartment, but those complaints were often dismissed or explained away by Dahmer as spoiled food. Dahmer, a shy man with an unremarkable appearance, secretly transformed his apartment into a chamber of torture and murder. He targeted young men, primarily African American and gay, whom he lured from bars or shopping centers. Dahmer's interest was not just in killing. He was obsessed with complete ownership of his victims, including retaining skulls, body parts, and engaging in acts of cannibalism. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered at least 17 men and boys. The most terrifying aspect of Dahmer's story is the proximity between the crimes and societal indifference. One of the most infamous incidents involved 14-year-old Konarak Senthasamphone. In May 1991, the boy managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment, naked and injured. 3 black women found him in the street and called the police. When officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them that the boy was his adult lover, and it was merely a domestic dispute between homosexuals. Despite the women's insistence that the boy needed help, and the fact that the boy appeared unable to speak English, the police handed Konarak back to Dahmer. Hours later, Konarak was killed. This devastating failure by the police, Edward fled into the street, begged for help from 2 police officers, and reported that Dahmer had handcuffed him. Police returned to the apartment with Edwards and began a search. When one officer opened the refrigerator, he was horrified to find a severed human head. Police immediately arrested Dahmer and searched the apartment. They found a gruesome cache: preserved human heads, bleached skulls, body parts stored in the freezer, and photographs of Dahmer's acts. Apartment 213 was a museum of madness. The arrest and trial of Jeffrey Dahmer shocked the world. Dahmer confessed to all his crimes, describing them emotionlessly. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and a psychotic disorder. The jury rejected the plea of insanity. Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of 15 counts of murder and sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, totaling over 957 years in prison. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is a chilling warning about the darkness that can exist within an ordinary individual and the danger of indifference to the pleas for help from society's marginalized. 2 years after his conviction, Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate in a maximum security prison in Wisconsin. Story 10. The Two Brothers. Welcome to the final episode of this true crime horror series. We conclude our journey with one of America's most controversial cases, where wealth, abuse, and greed intertwined, forcing the public to ask, could a horrific crime stem from desperation, or was it purely cold calculation? This is the story of Lyle and Eric Menendez. On the night of August 20th, 1989, in their luxurious Beverly Hills mansion, Jose and Kitty Menendez were brutally murdered with shotguns. Jose was a powerful entertainment executive, and Kitty was a former beauty queen. Their 2 sons, Lyle, age 21, and Eric, age 18, called the police in hysterics, claiming they had just returned home to discover the massacre. Their 911 call, filled with sobs and despair, quickly became an infamous recording. Initially, police suspected it was a brutal robbery, possibly related to Jose's business dealings. In the ensuing months, Lyle and Eric exhibited bizarre behavior, spending their parents' vast fortune lavishly. They purchased Rolex watches, Porsche cars, real estate, and threw extravagant parties. This conduct was entirely inconsistent with people who had just tragically lost their parents. The truth began to surface 6 months later. Eric Menendez confessed his crimes to his psychologist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. Subsequently, Oziel's former mistress informed the police about the confession. Lyle and Eric were arrested and charged with murder. The trial of the Menendez brothers became a national television phenomenon. The case exposed the dark underbelly of the Beverly Hills elite, featuring 2 completely contradictory narratives. The prosecution's version: Lyle and Eric were cold-blooded killers, motivated by greed. They murdered their parents to inherit the multi-million-dollar estate, then covered up the crime by feigning grief and squandering the fortune. The defense's version: the defense attorneys argued that the brothers were not greedy killers, but victims. They claimed that Jose and Kitty Menendez had systematically physically and sexually abused their sons throughout their childhood. The brothers killed their parents because they feared Jose was about to kill them after Eric threatened to expose the abuse. The first trial ended with a hung jury. Some believed the abuse narrative and saw the act as a form of self-defense, while others saw only greed. The second trial, held later, was legally stricter and less emotional. The prosecution successfully painted a picture of manipulation and lies. Although the abuse story was profoundly moving, the jury concluded that the brothers' actions were premeditated crimes, not immediate self-defense. In 1996, Lyle and Eric Menendez were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Menendez brothers' case is a complex horror story about the destruction of a family. It forced the public to confront the fact that the most heinous crimes can happen in the wealthiest homes, and that victims can become perpetrators. Though Lyle and Eric still insist they acted out of fear, their story remains a warning about the burden of family secrets and the danger of letting greed and desperation lead to violence. The 2 brothers are currently held in separate prisons in California, closing a chapter in American crime history about 2 siblings who violently ended their parents' lives. Thank you for listening to this series. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear the next series.